is Bean to Barstool, a podcast that looks at the intersections of craft beer and craft chocolate. My name is David Nilsson. I'm a professional beer writer and an advanced cicerone, and the creator and host of this show. The music for this episode is by my dear friend, indie folk musician Anna P.S. You can find out more about Anna's music in the show notes or at her website, annapsmusic.com. You can find links and information about our guests in the show notes as well. I hope you enjoy this episode of Bean to Barstool. When it comes to craft beer in the United States, hops are the ingredient that tends to get the most attention. These flowers resembling leafy green pine cones are responsible for providing bitterness and potentially a huge dose of aroma and flavor. They seduce beer lovers with robust flavors of citrus and tropical fruits, berries, herbs, flowers, and all sorts of other organic aromas. Beer drinkers often have favorite hops, and new beers featuring trendy hop varietals often lead to long waiting lines and sold-out releases. Malt hasn't generally provoked the same excitement, and that's really too bad, because while you can technically brew beer without hops, you can't brew it without malted grain, and the varieties of malts available offer a dazzling rainbow of potential colors, aromas, flavors, and textures for building a new beer. Prior to the mid-19th century in the United States, brewers generally malted their own barley for brewing. In the late 19th century, large malting companies were founded and began supplying malt to brewers. Until about 10 years ago, the majority of malt available to brewers, large or small, came from just a few fantastically large malt providers. The malts were reliably good, but somewhat homogeneous and lacking in regional or historical character. Over the last decade, we've seen a growing number of smaller artisan malt houses founded around the country to provide unique and characterful malt for the craft brewing industry. Often these maltsters utilize heritage grains or traditional malting techniques, allowing for the production of more authentic representations of historical beer styles. Just as often, though, they're providing standard workhorse malts for brewing any style of beer. In episode 5, we talked with Caleb Mashaki of Sugar Creek Malt in Indiana about his array of smoked malts, and while those unique malts grab headlines, Caleb keeps his lights on by producing quality base malts, about 1 million pounds a year, which sounds like a lot but is minuscule compared to the major malt producers. Malt is having a moment as serious beer fans begin to recognize more and more how exciting this ingredient can be when we stop thinking of it as an abstract commodity and recognize it as an artisan ingredient. Today, we'll dive into malt and look at examples of excellent malt being used both in beer and in chocolate. Before we get into the partnerships we're going to explore today between a maltster, a chocolate maker, and a brewer, let's first talk about what malt is and what its purpose is in the brewing process. This will get kind of nerdy, but indulge me for a few minutes as we journey down this particular rabbit hole. Malt is a grain, usually barley, but sometimes wheat, rye, oats, or something else, that has been prepared for brewing, a process I'll explain more in a moment. Malt provides all or almost all of the fermentable sugars for any given beer. It's almost always solely responsible for the color of a beer, and it provides the protein matrix that creates that attractive collar of foam on the top of a fresh pint. It's also what gives a beer an enjoyable texture or mouthfeel, and has a significant influence on a beer's flavor and aroma, in some cases providing almost all of the flavor or aroma in a given beer. Simply put, malt influences every single sensory aspect of a beer: appearance, texture, smell, and taste. So what does it mean that barley has been malted? It begins with natural processes in a grain of barley that are accelerated by the maltster, and concludes with a variety of ways the maltster then halts those processes. And to understand more about that, we have to talk about enzymes. Enzymes are intricately folded three-dimensional protein molecules that facilitate biochemical processes within an organism. Because of their dynamic role in living processes, it can be easy to think of them as microorganisms themselves, but they aren't alive. They just exist as part of larger organisms. Each enzyme generally performs a single task on a single material or substrate, and is helpfully named after the substrate it works on. Proteases work on proteins, for example. When I start to talk about enzymes during a beer event, I can sometimes see attendees begin to check out a bit, because even the word enzyme sounds hopelessly complex and scientifically abstract. In reality, the basic function of any individual enzyme isn't that hard to understand. As I mentioned, enzymes are protein molecules folded into specific three-dimensional shapes. That shape allows them to interact with and modify the structure of another substance at the molecular level, but prevents them from interacting with molecules of a different shape. You can think of each type of enzyme as a key that will fit a specific lock but won't fit another. So what does this have to do with malt? Every living organism has a variety of enzymes that allow basic cellular and biochemical processes to occur. In barley and other grains, some of those enzymes perform roles that allow an individual grain, or seed, to produce a new plant. Plants produce energy through photosynthesis, which requires sunlight. When a seed begins growing under the soil, however, it doesn't have access to sunlight, so it needs a reserve of energy to fuel the plant until it can break through the soil. Most of the bulk of a kernel of grain is comprised of carbohydrates that provide that fuel. The seed will ultimately need those in the form of simple sugars in order to use them, but sugars are perishable, so that fuel is locked up in a complex starch matrix held inside small pockets within the grain's endosperm. It's a stable storage system that can wait for months or even years for the right conditions, and once the right temperature and moisture conditions are met, enzymes are the keys that unlock that storage system. Plant hormones within the grain stimulate the production and release of enzymes that will turn that starch reserve into usable fuel. Hemicellulases and beta-glucanases break down the dividing membranes, proteases convert proteins into peptides and free amino acids, and amylases and dextrinases begin turning starch into sugar. A maltster manipulates those temperature and moisture conditions to stimulate the development of those enzymes because they're necessary for the brewing process. Proteins need to be reduced, starch reserves need to be exposed, and ultimately, starch needs to be converted into simple sugars like maltose in order to be fermented by brewing yeast. After a few days under the right hydration and temperature conditions, the grain's internal structure has been sufficiently modified to allow it to be brewed with, and at this point the maltster wants to halt the process, because otherwise the grain will do what it was supposed to do and grow a new barley plant. We don't want a new barley plant, we want beer. The maltster halts the modification process before all the starch is converted into sugar, so the brewer can finish that conversion during the brewing process. To halt the modification, the maltster dries the grain out, and the method used for this drying process will determine the type of malt that is produced. Base malts, the workhorse malts that provide the foundation for all beer styles, are dried at relatively low heat in kilns and retain their usable starches and the enzymes needed to convert those starches fully into sugars. The temperatures and times used to do this will lead to variations in these base malts. Different base malts can have flavors of flour, bread, crackers, cookies, toast, bread crust, nuts, or others. Roasted malts are roasted in a rotating drum roaster in much the same way coffee beans or cacao beans are roasted, and they take on many of the same flavors found in those foods, as well as burnt caramel, char, and others. The rotating drum allows for high temperatures to be applied without burning the malt, leading to dark colors and often intensely roasty flavors. The malt's diastatic enzymes are destroyed during this process, so this range of malts can only be used as a relatively small percentage of a beer's grain bill. Another group of malts are known as caramel or crystal malts. In these malts, the conversion process is completed, so the starches are completely converted into sugar, and the malt is then either roasted or kilned, crystallizing or caramelizing those sugars, leading to flavors of caramel, candy, dried fruit, toffee, and others. Once the malts have been dried out using one of these means, they are shelf-stable potentially for years, waiting for a brewer to complete the cereal grain's transformation into delicious beer. After grinding dried malts into a coarse meal, the brewer mixes them with hot water, generally around 150 degrees Fahrenheit, in a process called mashing. Over the course of about an hour, the diastatic enzymes developed during the malting process get to work breaking the malt starches into simple sugars in a process called saccharification. The primary enzymes at work, alpha and beta amylase, work in complementary ways to break apart amylases and amylopectins into mostly maltose and a few other simple sugars. Adjusting the temperature of the mash just a few degrees can favor one or the other of these enzymes and affect the amount of fermentable sugar in the wort, the sugary, malty liquid that will be fermented into beer, which will ultimately impact the beer's alcohol content and body. Malt isn't just malt. It's an entire fascinating world of hidden biochemical processes, and the science I just described meets culinary art inside an artisan malt house. One of the oldest and largest artisan malt houses in the country is Riverbend Malt near Asheville, North Carolina. Riverbend was founded in 2011, and they provide base and specialty malts for brewers around the country. Before we talk about beer, though, I want to talk about one of Riverbend's more unexpected and delightful partnerships with a guest we've had on Bean to Barstool before, French Broad Chocolates. French Broad uses malt powder from Riverbend in their best-selling malted milk 44% bar, and I recently spoke with French Broad founder J.L. Skeffington about this bar and the unique partnership behind it.
We'll be right back.
Hey everyone, Final Gravity Issue 5 is now available in the shop on beantobarstool.com. This 5th issue of our zine telling personal, human-centered stories from the world of beer is full of great articles. Bano Segudu tells the story of the South African beer style Umkombothi, poignantly explaining its role in her culture and the importance in her family's celebrations and milestones. Maria Krugliak writes about discovering the Portuguese half pint after moving to Portugal during the COVID-19 pandemic. Amanda Bruns and Obakeng Malope discuss the water spirit Mamuhaswa and the collaboration beer they brewed in her honor. These and numerous other stories fill the 56 pages of this zine. We've expanded it and added a few features for this issue. It's full color, full of lots of beautiful photography and art. Definitely check this out. It's on beantobarstool.com/shop. You can purchase this issue or subscribe, and you can always support us on Patreon and get extra perks as well. Cheers.
So Riverbend Malt House opened up in Asheville to serve the craft beer industry that was exploding. And with very similar goals of craft chocolate makers to really bring quality and integrity to an integral ingredient that is sometimes taken for granted. So they wanted to work with North Carolina and other local and regional farmers and to really work with specific varietals of grains, of barley in particular, to create something that kind of elevated and really made a flavor impact on a beer. So we went and toured their factory and just learned about their goals and their challenges and the innovative, creative ways in which they were creating a new kind of business, this artisan malt house, and, watching them grow. It's just been a cool process to be sort of adjacent to their growth and their, how they bring their values into their work. So we, malted milk chocolate is, again, I always seem to find myself in the childhood nostalgia flavor trap. But malted milk chocolate is definitely one of those flavors that you can close your eyes and you feel taken back. And whether it's my dad eating the Whoppers candy like out of the milk carton packaging, just like putting it back.
It must be a very dad thing.
It's a very dad thing. And chocolate malts and just the flavor is so embedded in childhood. So we are really excited to pair our chocolate with their malt. We had an added level of local collaboration with a local flour mill. So again, flour is something that has become a commodity, and not many people think about where their flour comes from or where it's milled from. And so we had this company that started up, Carolina Ground, that really worked on sourcing wheat and other grains and getting, a really beautiful mill, I think from Switzerland, if I'm not mistaken, and milling flour for, the local baking community. So they get the malted barley and grind it into flour, and then we add that flour to our milk chocolate. So the chocolate itself, it's a blend of different cacao origins to create kind of the flavor balance that we wanted the milk chocolate to contribute. We brown butter. We get grass-fed organic butter that, we brown, which adds like a nutty kind of caramely flavor profile. And the malt flour adds like not only the flavor, the sweetness of the malt, but kind of this baked good character and a texture, like we're not shying away from the texture that the flour contributes. And it's like you taste it, it tastes like some kind of cookie. Like it feels like there's cinnamon and nutmeg in the chocolate, but that's just the cacao, the chocolate, and the malt coming together to create that flavor profile. But it's definitely one of my favorites. It's one of our customers' favorites. It's been in our lineup since we opened the factory in 2012, and yeah, definitely the best seller.
After talking with JL, I reached out to Brian Simpson, one of the founders of Riverbend Malt. Before Riverbend, Brian was a geologist, working in hydrogeology and then as an environmental consultant for the Southern Appalachian Highland Conservancy. We'll hear all about the mission and work of Riverbend Malt from Brian in a moment, but I wanted to hear from him first about the malt used in French Broad's chocolate bar and his thoughts on partnering with a bean-to-bar chocolate maker.
Well, we had always known that there's thousands of food products out there using malted barley as some sort of low glycemic index sweetener. It's also healthier than sugar. Malt extract gets used in thousands of products, cereals in particular. We always knew that there was an opportunity for it, but we weren't really set up for it. But we have a friend that runs a company, again, another artisan company called Carillon Ground, which could be interesting for you to talk to. But she's a miller and wonderfully hardworking person and eclectic personality and expert at her craft. She's a baker. But anyway, she offered the opportunity to make a flour from our heritage malt, which is it's a hybrid. It's not really a Munich or a Vienna. It's sort of in between those two worlds, made with a 6-row barley. It was actually the first malt that we ever made. All the malt was actually heritage to start out with because I didn't have a blower that would allow fresh air in. We recirculated everything, and it created a really dark, rich, melanoidin-rich malt. And so that's what goes into this chocolate bar. And when you taste it, it's immediately evident that they used it, at least when I taste it. You may not, unless you've chewed on the malt before, but side by side, it's definitely evident that it comes through. It's really cool. I love the French Broad chocolates and their concept. They've killed it.
What they're doing is remarkable.
Yeah.
Beyond French Broad, do you have any relationship to bean-to-bar chocolate or an interest in craft chocolate?
I haven't given it a lot of thought. I mean, I've put a little work into looking at some extract material for various reasons, like creating an extract product, and not really developed it yet. So I would like to do more with a company like French Broad, as much as we could. It just fits in our ethos, and philosophically we measure up really well. And it's just like we're sort of kindred spirits when it comes to work ethic and, crazy concepts, and I don't know.
French Broad isn't alone in using barley malt in chocolate. In addition to craft chocolate makers working with craft breweries on chocolate-infused beers and beer-infused chocolates, a number of makers are using malted barley as a way to add unique flavors and textures to their bars. In Milwaukee, Indulgence chocolatiers have 2 different bars using this ingredient. Their 58% cacao porter bar is intended to evoke the flavors of the eponymous beer style and is made with espresso, malted barley, and unmalted roasted barley. The grains provide a satisfying crunch to the bar, and with the espresso, bring to mind a dry, roasty, lightly spiced coffee stout. Their IPA bar is a curiosity. This 64% bar is made with malted barley, coriander, and orange peel, which really makes it taste more like a Belgian wit beer, which is made with those spices, than a hoppy IPA. My wife and I visited the Indulgence Shop and Pairing Bar in the Walker's Point neighborhood of Milwaukee a couple years back when we were in town to catch a concert by the Scottish band Churches, and the bar provides pairing flights of craft beers and chocolates together. It was a great experience, and I loved seeing a chocolate maker do this. I hope to have Indulgence on the show soon. In Reykjavik, Iceland, Omnam Chocolate also have a couple bars featuring barley or barley malt. Their black and burnt barley bar uses roasted malts, organic Icelandic barley, and barley malt extract in a white chocolate bar that's actually jet black because of the addition of activated charcoal. The barley has the texture of puffed rice cereal, and the bar is a sweet, caramely treat. Puffed barley also shows up in the Super Choco Berry Barley Nibbly Nutty Licious bar. I almost got to visit the Omnam factory on a spit of land sticking out into the North Atlantic by the Reykjavik harbor a few years back, but arrived about 10 minutes too late. Maybe next time. Charm School Chocolate in Maryland uses malted barley as well as malted millet in the caramel malt bar, but I haven't had the chance to try that one yet. If you know of others, please let me know. As Brian and I talked, he shared the fascinating story behind Riverbend Malt and the belief in Southern agriculture that drives it. He hung out in the back of his van as we talked to avoid the noise inside the malt house, and his laid-back Southern style belied the hard work that has gone into building one of the most respected malt companies in the country, and one that thrives in the craft beer mecca of Asheville, North Carolina. You benefited a little bit geographically where you are. I mean, you might be in the highest concentration of quality breweries in the country.
I think we are per capita. We're really close. I know that. Yeah, and I mean, when we started, there were 14 breweries in Asheville, right in the county. And Brent and I were like, I don't want to be the 15th, man. That's got to be the first, last one in and the first one out, you know? There's like 42 now. We were totally wrong. Yeah. The other idea was we really thought from basically these brewers were all just killing it. You know, 4 beers on tap, with a seasonal rounding things out. And that was it. You know, we had a pale ale, a porter, an IPA, maybe a stout, and then a seasonal. And we were like, wow, you know, who wants to get in the lineup and compete with that, you know? But they're all using malt. So let's see if we can service that side of it and bring agriculture truly back into the game. And that was really important for us, is to create some jobs and then also get that dollar circulating back around these farms. You know, these brewers are just high-fiving themselves, you know, all over the place for the great job they're doing making local beer. And really there wasn't anything local about it except for the water and their expertise, of course, which is not discounted, but like most of the grain was coming from either Canada or overseas. You know, forget the carbon footprint. We were thinking about the dollar. You know, where's that dollar going when a tourist comes in town, drinks the beer, and then that dollar goes back to Europe, basically, or Canada. And we thought, wow, we can maybe do that. So now, you know, just from building that infrastructure, we've got, you know, our grower network that we pay a premium price to, which is important to us. It makes it worthwhile for them to give us good barley, and I think it puts a little money in their pocket. And then we pay the seed cleaner to clean it a lot of the time. And then we pay the shipper to ship it to us. And then we malt it and create jobs here and then send that back out. So look at how many times that $1 kind of gets to spin around in this economy. And then they go out and take our message with them and go to the farmer's market or go to the local stores and buy their food and their beer. And, you know, and there's a story there. So anyway.
The connection to agriculture, I think, is something that is only just making its way back into craft beer. For the first few decades of modern craft beer, I don't feel like consumers had any real awareness of beer as an agricultural product.
You'd be surprised at how many brewers don't really realize that. that, I think one of your questions was, how do we connect that to the consumer? Their direct connection is to these brewers. They got so much access now. And, when we started in Nashville, another thing we had in our favor was there was a saying that the Chamber of Commerce was using called "local is the new black." And that was 10 years ago, where there was a big push for farmers markets and local food and artisan approach to things, a little bit slower. And we sort of were thinking about that concept and saying, well, let's be true to it then, let's bring this in. And along the way, I think we've brought a few consumers along with us, but it's sort of drifted, and it has with a lot of brewers, started off real strong here in town, but then there was this big IPA craze, and now it's all about, getting those taps on the wall, man, and some of the message got lost. But the guys that it resonates with, it runs deep, and I think that carries a lot of weight. And if they want to use that as a marketing strategy, i.e. like the craft malt seal or their local intentions and the giving to their community and stuff like that, they want that message to ring true. This is one way they can do it, and they can use that marketing to help them move some beers. Obviously, if I come into town and I want a taste of Dayton or a taste of Asheville, I'm going to walk in and go, what's the most local thing you got in here? And that bartender or that brewer is going to be like, well, here, this is made with actually locally sourced material, hand done here in town and delivered right back to us, and that beer sells pretty quick,
What do you think is lost when consumers or brewers don't keep that connection in mind of the role of agriculture?
You got to be careful here. I don't think that their brewing prowess is lost or their skill set is lost, but there's something about the integrity of what you do that may get lost or maybe misinform your consumer. You're missing an opportunity to take advantage of something very unique that's really only found here. Mm-hmm. There's nowhere else on the planet that makes a material like I make it, makes a malt like I make it, that sources the ingredients like we do. It'd be like saying, take a super high-end restaurant, that one chef makes a particular item very well, say it's his steak. You can't take that somewhere else and reproduce it, no matter how you try. Mm-hmm. And I think some of that is what is missing, or whether it gets lost. I don't know if it's ever found, with brewers. And it's evident when we go in to do our sales call or just introduce ourselves and talk about beer with these guys, what their interest is in the craft itself. And some of the guys still are just kind of reading the recipe and then backfilling that recipe with whatever comes off the menu from whatever malt producer they're ordering from. And then some of the guys are like true artisans and chefs, where they taste their malt and then build that recipe around it. So I guess instead I'd twist your question just a little bit and say, I think it's more what can be found in what we do.
Sure.
And that was sort of the renaissance for us, conceptually. You talk about French broad chocolates and those guys, they're making chocolate, but not like anybody else in the world,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And they're fantastic people.
Back before COVID started, I was doing a lot of beer education events, tastings and things like that. And it's always a challenge to get people to care about ingredients. You've got to start at the place of flavor and then work back. What have you found in terms of ways that we can make the consumer care about something like malt, about something like a heritage grain? How do we go about that education component?
Yeah. And again, I think it leaves my hands and goes into a brewer's hands, because that is the connection to our customer. I think you have to be very vocal about your process. And even if it's not craft malt, let's say you're using one of the big guys, raw or something like that, to know why you're doing that, as a brewer. Why is that important to you that you go with that flavor profile for your base? How does that impact your hops? And I think if guys, when they're learning the process of brewing, would start from that point rather than starting from the beer, which is the end point, maybe that would muddy the waters a little less, and then the ingredient, I mean, just imagine if you're a painter and you didn't care about your paint. I mean, what happens to your process at that point? And for us, the malt kind of seems to be it's 80-90% of your beer from dry ingredients, yet it gets very little attention. And I think getting people to recognize that is really important. So, just us existing and then craft maltsters existing has had a huge impact on that, at least where they exist. I don't know how else to put that, the fact that we walk in the brewery and introduce ourselves and say, this is what our process is, has to be a catalyst for something for these guys, or they would be doing some other job. It blows my mind to walk into a brewery sometimes and they're just like, yeah, the malt, I mean, it's over there. And you're like, what? I'm like, it's surprising. And then you got guys like, Fauna and then Carillon, that their whole being is driven around that piece, that component, those flavors. Local sourcing aside, regional sourcing aside, it's so important to them that their ethos is packaged by it. And I think seeing those guys do well is really a testament to that process.
I know you've done some work to specifically revive some heritage regional grains and things like that. Can you briefly share a few of those that are of note?
Yeah, I mean, probably more appropriately, we brought in some new varieties into the game that weren't necessarily heritage. A couple of them are heirloom grains, which is a little different terminology, which you gotta be careful with.
You can clarify. Go ahead. What is the
yeah, so the heirloom grains have been around many years, sometimes 200 and 300 years. A lot of them came from Northern Europe. They were utilized by different groups through the year for all kinds of things. Some of that was bread, some of it was erosion control, like it just runs the gamut. And some of it was for beer, early on. And so for us, we started there, Obviously, we want to use something that already grows here, whether it's a malting variety by the American standard or not. Let's try it and see what happens, because we know that we have a better chance of successfully growing that material. Pulling in another material, a variety from another region, and then trying to bring it here and then hope for that success was very risky. And so we went to the guys at NC State, and David said, hey, this is not an heirloom grain, but it's been grown here for a while. We did the research on it to help another large brewer trying to find a source of barley on the East Coast so they wouldn't have to travel as far with it. Why don't you try that? And he sent me home with a bag of grain. So it started there. And then in a classic Riverbend move, Brent calls me, one afternoon and says, hey, I got this guy, he wants to send us some rye. And I'm like, I don't know how to malt rye. I've never malted rye before in my life. Well, the truck's going to be there tomorrow morning, so we'll figure it out. And it kind of went like that. So we started malting Renza Bruzi, which is a very old native grain, semi-native grain. And most varieties only survive say 20 years in the market. Like Maris Otter, people think it's been around hundreds of years. Really was developed, I think, in the 50s, maybe close to 1960. Even that grain is very old by malting barley standards. They get developed for about 10 years. They make it in the marketplace for about 15 years as a variety, and then you're on to a new one, mostly because they're not heirloom grains. So their ability to succumb to like fungal pressure or pest pressure, Mother Nature and low yields and things become evident really quick, because nature's abusive, very aggressive. And so anyway, when you get a grain like Renza Bruzi that has this great, crazy, spicy flavor profile, and it just carries over into the beer, it's amazing. And that thing truly tells a story of our history, about agriculture, about perseverance, and all of those things. And so that's why it's really interesting to me to do that. So we try to work with stuff that we're kind of close or can get close to, so from a historical value too. So a lot of varieties that we work with in the malt house now actually were derived from very old French varieties that were brought over and hybridized with some regional material. So still has a remnant of that past in it.
When would those have been coming over, the French varieties?
Man, I'd have to go back and look at some history. It varies. Depends on what, like some of these crosses are fairly new, 20, 30 years, and some of them are 50, 100 years ago. If you go back through the books, you can find relatives of these varieties through history. You know, it's sort of a slow roll. This is a natural crossing of these things. They don't really, you can genetically cross them, but they're not, there's no genetically modified barleys that I'm aware of on the planet right now that are being used commercially. So they're all natural crosses. So they're all bleeding into one another to try to get to a place that you want to, like you would with roses or anything else.
Sure.
So it's pretty fascinating. I could, if this were to end today, I could spend a good bit of time just getting into small grains.
Riverbend's traditional malt has found a natural home in a brewery that takes tradition very, very seriously. Carillon Brewing in Dayton, Ohio operates on the grounds of the Carillon Historical Park, Dayton's history museum. It's the only brewery in the country operating out of a historical museum, and their brewing process is truly something to behold. When the brewery was built in 2014, it was built to replicate the breweries that would have been active in Dayton in 1850. The beer is brewed on a tiered brick structure that houses period-correct open copper brewing vessels, multiple fireplaces, and a complex internal flue system. The brew house is entirely gravity-fed and wood-fired, and the beer is fermented at ambient room temperature in virgin oak barrels. The beers themselves are based on historical recipes and include familiar styles like porter and unexpected historical curiosities like coriander ale, which is brewed with coriander and chili peppers and is based on a homebrewing recipe found in a magazine for housewives from 1831. Head brewer Kyle Spears helped establish the brewery with founding brewer Tanya Brock, who has since moved on to Dayton's Fifth Street Brew Pub. Kyle now shares brewing duties with Dan Loro, and both Kyle and Dan are historians by training rather than trained professional brewers. Through trial and error over the years, they've developed the ability to brew fantastic beers on 170-year-old technology. I've had the chance to brew with Kyle and Dan a few times over the years, most recently when we developed a Lichtenheiner recipe last fall for an educational beer event I led at Carillon, and it's always a memorable experience. The basics of how beer is brewed haven't really changed all that much in the last 2 centuries, despite improvements in technology, efficiency, and consistency. I talked recently with the Carillon brewers about using Riverbend malts and their past adventures in roasting their own malt. Kyle begins here, and you'll hear from Dan as well.
We'll be right back.
Hey everyone, my book on pairing craft beer and craft chocolate is available now on Amazon and on the Bean to Barstool shop. Pairing Beer and Chocolate, a guide to bringing the flavors of craft beer and craft chocolate together, is out now. This paperback book explains the process of pairing beer and chocolate, includes a guide to hosting a pairing at home, walks through dozens of beer styles to provide style-by-style pairing guidance, and gives room for taking your own pairing notes along the way. This is the only book on pairing beer and chocolate available. Grab your copy now at the link in the show notes or on Amazon. If you manage a tap room, bookstore, chocolate shop, or cafe and want to stock the book, get in touch about our easy wholesale process. Beer and chocolate belong together, and this book is your guide to getting the most out of every pairing.
We switched over a few years ago. When we first started, we were brewing almost exclusively with a heritage 6-row variety of malt, which would have been utilized historically, but by the 1850s, they also had 2-row. And Riverbend came to us after they had developed a new product, which was a 2-row blend of locally sourced malt, barley grains from down in Asheville, North Carolina, which is where they're located. And they sent some up to us, and right away, it kind of transformed the overall flavor of a lot of our beers, because it's essentially our base malt now for most of the beer styles we do. And that one is this really amazingly aromatic and flavorful blend of barley that kind of replicates Maris Otter, traditional English malt. but to me has this really unique kind of almost sweetgrass like aroma and flavor. So in a beer like our Coriander Ale, which is exclusively that 2-row blend of malt, to me it has this underlying kind of sweetgrass note, like the baskets that you would have found made in Charleston, South Carolina, for instance, which is something I grew up smelling when I was visiting family down there. So that's been kind of a fun one for us. We also use a dark Munich malt from them to give some extra color and flavor to some of our beers.
That one does really good for the little amount that we use in the Irish Red. I think it makes a big difference just with the character of the beer itself. I know I was talking to another brewer in town, and he's a fan of our red, and he didn't realize that we were using a dark Munich in it. So it's interesting to see people's reactions in the industry when they see some of the stuff we're using.
What flavors does that bring to that beer?
That one, and when I open the bag, I get that, it's almost like a crystal sweetness. It almost has it's a dark Munich. It has a lot of those kind of caramel sweet notes to it, which surprised me a little bit. And so you get a little bit of that. And I think it definitely helps with the color in that beer, and provides a little bit of body to that beer. Because the only other malt that we put in there besides the Select is a small amount of our house-made crystal. So,
yeah, so you guys roast a couple of your own malts. Tell me about that.
Yeah, a few years ago, we decided we needed a little more body in some of our beers, and kind of a malty sweet note that we hadn't been getting from some of the other base malts that we were using. And when we try to do as much in-house as possible. And the notion came up to us one day that we could probably try to pull off what is essentially like a crystal malt or a caramel malt. So we take typically Pilsner malt from Riverbend, which is a 6-row variety, that we use in a few of our beers, and we'll soak that grain overnight in hot water. And this was a big learning process for us. It probably took us about a year to get to a point where we were able to do it fairly efficiently. So general rundown, we take this dried malted grain, soak it in a big copper kettle overnight, not overheat, just with room temperature water. And then on the day that we're actually going to process it, we'll bring it up to a mashing temperature. So usually around 150 to 152 degrees Fahrenheit. And essentially kind of mash that grain on the inside. This grain has not ever been milled at this point yet either. So whole kernels of barley that have been previously malted, and then we essentially mash them and transform those inherent starches inside of those grains down into sugar. Once that process is done, it takes about an hour, just like any normal mash that you would do for a beer brew day. We'll take those still whole grains, put them onto sheet trays, and then load them into an oven and bake them. So if you do it correctly for the right temperature, the right amount of time, you essentially kind of cook those already converted sugars down in those grains into a literally like a crystal candy almost. So when you eat that, when you smell it, it has this really sweet smell, almost like toffee candy. And when you eat it, if you eat it straight, it tastes like toffee as well. So it lends a totally unique character, and it's a one-off malt. Nobody else is doing that we know of right now, or at least the way we're doing it. So it makes some of our beers even that much more unique.
Does it pick up any smokiness from that?
Not so much, because when we roast it in the wood-fired oven, if we have the time to do that, our wood-fired oven, we don't keep the fire inside of the oven while we're actually cooking in it. You build fire in there to get the brick hot, and then we go through a whole process of brooming out all the ash and any coal that's left over, and then mopping it. So it's a fairly clean oven. You can smell it while you open it up, but we've never really noticed a huge amount of smokiness from that oven itself.
No.
We'll hear much more from Kyle and Dan about Carillon Brewing in an upcoming episode. During my talk with Brian at Riverbend, we talked about the natural harmony between his malt and Carillon's brewing ethos. We also spoke about another brewery we've discussed on this show previously, Fontaflora, whose Seinhaus beer was discussed in episode 5 and 7, and what it's like to taste beers that have used his malts. Speaking of history, we mentioned Carillon. Share a little bit of your perspective on what they're doing there. It's very unique.
Yeah, so I was blown away. The the first brewer there that's helped start it.
Tanya.
Yeah, Tanya. I showed up in town and said, "Hey, this is what I do. I'd be really interested in meeting you." And then immediately we got along and had an interest in what the other person was doing. And then, obviously we were floor malting everything, traditional method at the time. And we were doing some throwback recipes, which we still do with our malt that we named Heritage, which is a 6-row barley, which is very similar to some of the European barleys back in the turn of the century, whenever brewing was kind of, blowing up. And there were a lot of female brewers. So that was interesting to me from a historical perspective. And then, that went on, and the earthy nature of some of the malts that we're producing really fit in well with the beers that they were producing. And over time, it's just sort of the relationship has built and stuck. And I've been up there a few times to meet with Kyle and talk about his process, and helped him work on his mill a couple of times to make sure that was running, and, helping him get some efficiencies, and just a great group of people. And I love the concept, and it's always just, it's been one of my favorite customers, to be honest.
Yeah, what they're doing is very interesting. I had the chance to write a recipe and then brew a Lichtenheiner with them last year that we used some of your grain in.
Yeah.
I believe they're using a lot of your Southern Select as a base. Is that right?
Yep.
Tell me a little bit about that.
Select and some Appalachian wheat, which is some local wheat that we grow. And we have a little bit of a unique recipe on the malting side of that. And trying to think, a lot of rye too. They end up inadvertently use a lot of our rye.
Yeah, they do one of their pretty popular beers is a rye base.
That's a beautiful beer too. I forget what he calls it, but it's a real great beer. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Tell me a little bit about the Southern Select. What's unique about that? That's a blend, right, of a few different things?
Yeah, and again, a little bit unconventional. A lot of malt houses try to get single variety to do a lot of the things they do. And what Brent and I realized, we have some friends here in town, obviously. Asheville has an artisan, at least one of everything. So there were a couple of our friends are coffee roasters, and they'll do blends of beans and blend those beans to get flavor profiles. And and for years we just had all these scientists telling us, the variety doesn't make a difference on the flavor, right? It just can't. And I'm like, how could it not? How could it not? So what we started doing was working with these varieties in very small batches when we started getting these 2-row varieties in house. First off, people wanted us to test them and see how they were going to go, and either scientists or growers. And we immediately saw that, if we put a couple of things together, that we can maybe coax a little bit different flavor out of the material. So one year's Select might not be the next year's Select, depending on how those varieties turn out. And so we were like, we'll call it Southern Select, and we'll put together something that's like the best of the South varieties that we can get. And that's what we'll do. And that's sort of the marketing around that.
You mentioned using a lot of 6-row. Have you run into much resistance from brewers of working with that?
Yeah, it was awful. At the beginning. They wouldn't even talk to us. And I'm like, I swear to God, it'll make beer. It's going to be great, And now we still have a pretty big following. Most of our varieties now or styles of malt are built around the 2-row barley as a base. But our Pilsner still is, I'd put it up against anything on the planet. It's a wonderful tasting malt, and that is still driving a lot of business for us. So it was almost once people started using it, I couldn't get them away from it, even though I did have 2-row varieties coming into play here. There were no 2-row varieties in the South to even start with for the first 5 years of our company, so that's all I had to work with. So that's what I made, and the beers were fantastic.
Let's talk about those relationships a little bit. You mentioned Fonta Flora, and everything they're doing is driven around agriculture or around ingredients, whether they're growing it right on their property or sourcing something from you. Tell me a little bit from your perspective on what they're doing there.
Yeah, I mean, it's been interesting. Todd sort of started up right around the same time we did, trying to branch out and do his own thing. And from the initial concept, that's what he wanted to do. And obviously we wanted to help support that. And so through the years, you know, the ebb and flow of things, that's what we've tried to do. And I think that partnership has really resonated into something that that he can rally around and that his customer base is very familiar with. So I think that that's a very different customer base than, say, Warped Wing or Rheingeist even, you know. It's totally different. And the messaging, it's sort of, a lot of brewers will tell you, you know, I'm just making what people want to drink. Well, IPAs wouldn't exist if that was the case, you know. Like, it sort of sneaks up on you. It's an ebb and flow of, like, a few people are making some things that they want people to try, then people want to drink it, and then those guys want to make that so people want to come drink it, you know. Like, and with Todd, it's sort of he you know, Fauna Flora, they just started there, like, here's what we're going to do, and I think people are going to like it, and you know, they do. There's a lot in that.
What's it like for you to get to taste a beer that has used your malt? When you go into a brewery that's using your stuff, how is that different for you to get to taste that in the finished beer?
It's probably the best part of this whole experience, because the feeling is still the same as it was the first couple of beers that were commercially done, where you're like, I can't believe this is actually happening, you know?
Yeah. I
could sneak into a place and sit in the back corner, and really, you listen to people taste the beer and they talk about the beer. You know, regardless of what's going on, a lot of times they, at least at the beginning of that conversation, start talking about the nuances of that beer and the character of it. And like, wow, I didn't think it was going to be so malty, or da-da-da, you know, and that was really fascinating to me. So I would just go places and sit and listen to those conversations, sort of eavesdrop a little bit. And it was kind of cool, you know, to hear them talk about it most of the time, unless the beer was bad. And then
have you had any particular experiences that stand out in your memory of tasting one of those beers?
Yeah, there's a couple. Really, a very significant one for me that stands out just right off the cuff here without giving any thought was probably when New Belgium was doing their groundbreaking, and they had just done their second round of rye IPA, a rye PA, which was a beautifully built recipe around Renza Bruzzi, our Carolina rye. And they had just, one of their experimental brewers had come out from Fort Collins, and their marketing guy, and came to see the malt house, which was like, it was in the old banana room. It was like this 1,000 square foot room. We were making like 1,800 pounds batch sizes. They saw it and were just blown away, you know, and we're like, let's put that in a beer, you know, and then ordered like 27,000 pounds of it, you know. I'm making 1,800 pounds at a time. And to be at the groundbreaking ceremony when they broke that beer out and gave everybody a bottle was pretty exciting.
Yeah, that sounds neat.
It was a big moment.
New Belgium is a large craft brewery whose standard beers are available in supermarkets across the country, but they maintain a spirit of experimentation with their barrel and foeder aging program. Of particular interest to this show, they recently released a beer called Exquisite Extraction. This dark sour ale is brewed with Ethiopian Orca Chabessa and Gara washed whole bean coffee from Black and White Roasters in Raleigh, North Carolina, as well as Dominican cacao nibs and husks from Baderi Chocolate in Raleigh. The beer is just fascinating, and I'm hoping to get someone from New Belgium on the show to discuss it soon. You can order this and other New Belgium barrel-aged beers at newbelgium.com, and they even ship in a returnable container with a postage-paid return label to cut down on waste. I always finish interviews for Bean to Barstool with the same question, regardless of whether I'm talking to a chocolate maker, a brewer, or in this case, a maltster. What story is your chocolate or beer or malts or what have you telling? It gets to the heart of what this podcast is about, the stories that weave through and around and between our favorite indulgences, including but going far beyond their sensory experiences. So I asked Brian, what story is your malt telling at Riverbend?
You know, frankly, I think it tells the story of our growers and really the American dream that's still alive, and regardless of politics, that you know, that they really are the heart of what is happening in the U.S., you know, from a food perspective, agricultural perspective. We owe a lot to these guys. And for a long time, they were disregarded. And I think we're one very cool message that can illuminate the fact that they're real people working in fields with dirty hands and not all the equipment or money they need. And we're a way for them to have a voice. And I think that's where we started with our story, and that's the malt with a mission. And I think that's what we continue to do.
French Broad Chocolates takes its name from the French Broad River, which wends its way through Asheville. And I thought maybe the river informed Riverbend's choice in a name as well. Brian and his co-founders picked the name, however, to signal that they wanted their thoughtful approach to malt, from seed to barley plant to finished product, to represent a bend in the supply chain, a way of approaching the malting business that would diverge from the mainstream and form its own path. Lovers of bean-to-bar chocolate are familiar with how slow of a process it can be to change the perception and culture around a plant-based ingredient, transitioning from abstract commodity crop designed for homogeneity and value into artisan product built for flavor and quality. While malt was never subjected to the labor abuses cacao continues to be mired in, and the malt being produced by the corporate malt houses is of good brewing quality, there's little regional character and focus on flavor and on the heritage of the crop itself. Riverbend and other artisan malt houses are producing excellent malt that shows care for the land and its history, and for the drinker increasingly disconnected from that land. The story behind our favorite beers and chocolates begins with the story of its ingredients, and good malt has a beautiful story to tell. You can find out more about Riverbend Malt, French Broad Chocolates, and Carillon Brewing in the show notes for this episode. If there's a topic you'd like to see covered on this podcast, drop me a line through social media or at beantobarstool@gmail.com. You can also let me know if you've had good chocolate beers or beer-infused chocolates, or if you come across any you think I would find interesting. Let your friends know about this show if you think they would enjoy it, and you can share it with your favorite chocolate makers or brewers even. And of course, you can leave a review on your preferred listening platform. If you feel inspired to share one of your own beer and chocolate pairings on Instagram, tag the post with the #BeanToBarstool hashtag so I can see it and comment. The music for this episode was performed by my friend Anna P.S. You can find out more about her in the show notes or at her website, annapsmusic.com. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Bean to Barstool.